We thought there was something wrong with the criminal. But what if the real story was that the nation helped create the crime? ZeitCrimes explores the crimes that didn't just shock us. They reshaped society, power, and history itself. ZeitCrimes, crimes that changed the nation.
Before we begin, I need to be clear about what this episode contains and why. This episode includes detailed discussion of homicide, sexual violence, kidnapping, psychological manipulation, and the systematic targeting of women. It deals with the murder of a 12-year-old child. It discusses the failures of law enforcement, the biases of the media, and the ways in which society enabled violence by refusing to take it seriously. I do not produce episodes like this for entertainment. I produce them because I believe that understanding how something this catastrophic happens, understanding the history, the sociology, the politics, the failures, is the only response to it. If we treat these cases as spectacle, we learn nothing. If we examine them seriously, we gain a new perspective. If you are a survivor of sexual violence, or if you have lost someone to violent crime, please take care of yourself first. This episode will be here when and if you are ready to listen to it. It's November 8th, 1974, Salt Lake City, Utah. The Fashion Place Mall is busy on a weekday evening, the way malls were in the 1970s. Families, teenagers, the particular hum of fluorescent light and linoleum. Carol Durant is 18 years old. She's shopping. She has no reason to be afraid. A man approaches her. He is clean-cut. He smiles easily. He's wearing a badge, or something that looks like one. He tells her, calmly and with apparent concern, that someone has attempted to break into her car in the parking lot. He'd like her to come with him, he says, to the police substation in the mall to file a report. He says his name is Officer Roseland. Carol Durant goes with him because he looked like someone you could trust, because the mall felt safe, because in November of 1974, in a shopping center in Salt Lake City, Utah, you did not expect the man with the badge to be the danger. Within minutes, they are in a Volkswagen Beetle, not heading towards any police station or substation for that matter. A handcuff snaps onto her left wrist. He produces a crowbar. She screams and fights harder, perhaps, than he expected. And she gets the door open and throws herself into the road. A passing car stops. She survives. Carol Durant was one of the very few that lived to talk about her attempted kidnapping. The man that put that handcuff on her wrist had a name that most of you already know. He was 27 years old at the time. He had a law acceptance letter. He had a girlfriend who adored him. He had colleagues who considered him one of the most promising young men in Washington State Republican Party politics. He had volunteered on a suicide prevention hotline where a co-worker later wrote that he was gentle, warm, and genuinely good at his job. His name was Theodore Robert Bundy. And today on ZeitCrimes, we are going to talk about him, not because he deserves the attention. He does not. But because understanding what he did, how he did it, and why America allowed it to continue for as long as it did, tells us something urgent and deeply uncomfortable about the world he moved through. A world in many ways that still exists today. Let's look at the historical record. America in the 1970s. To understand Ted Bundy, you need to understand the era, not as an excuse. There is no excuse, but as a context without which the story makes no sense. Because one of the most important questions in the Bundy case is not who he was, but how he operated for so long without being stopped. And the answer to that question is almost entirely structural. The United States in the early 1970s was a country in a state of profound, disorienting transition. The optimism of the early 1960s had been hollowed out by Vietnam, by the assassinations of John F. Kennedy, Martin Luther King, and Robert Kennedy, by the urban uprisings of 1967 and 1968, and finally by Watergate, which confirmed for a generation that the most powerful institutions in the country were capable of systematic, deliberate deception. At the same time, enormous social changes were actively reshaping American life. The women's liberation movement had moved from the margins to the mainstream. The Equal Rights Amendment was moving through state legislatures. Women were entering universities, law schools, and medical schools in unprecedented numbers. They were living alone, living independently, living in a way that the previous generation's women largely had not. There was a powerful cultural backlash to all of this. It's not organized, not always conscious, but pervasive. A deep ambivalence about women who operated outside traditional structures, who lived in dormitories, who hitchhiked, who went to parties, who made their own choices about where they went and when they came home. This ambivalence had consequences that were, in the most literal sense, lethal. Meanwhile, law enforcement in the United States was fundamentally unprepared for what was coming. The FBI's Behavioral Science Unit, the unit that would eventually help develop the concept of criminal profiling, had been founded only in 1972. It was small, underfunded, and operating out of a basement at the Quantico training facility. There was no national database of violent crimes. There was no system for sharing information about missing persons across state lines. Investigators in Washington state had no reliable way to know that investigators in Utah and Colorado were looking at what appeared to be the same kind of crime. Ted Bundy did not create these gaps, but he understood them instinctively or consciously, and he used them. He crossed state lines deliberately. He changed his methods enough to complicate pattern recognition. He looked exactly like the kind of man in the culture had taught people to trust. Who was Ted Bundy? Theodore Robert Bundy was born on November 24, 1946, in Burlington, Vermont. He was born to an unmarried mother, Louise Caldwell, at a home for unwed mothers, and for the first years of his life was raised believing that his grandparents were his parents and that his mother was his sister. When his mother eventually moved to Tacoma, Washington, and later married a man named Johnny Bundy, Ted took his stepfather's name, but reportedly never felt close to him. This biographical detail has been analyzed extensively, sometimes to the point of overreach. Bundy's defenders and apologists have pointed to his illegitimacy and the deception around his parentage as explanations for his psychology. I want to be careful here. Millions of people grow up under difficult circumstances, and they do not become serial killers. The biographical facts of Bundy's early life are relevant to understanding how he developed his psychology of deception, and his deep interest in image and performance. They are not a cause, and they are not an excuse. By all accounts, Bundy was academically capable and socially adept. He attended the University of Washington, where he studied psychology. He became involved in Republican Party politics in the state, working on the gubernatorial campaign of Dan Evans in 1968, and later at the Seattle Crime Prevention Advisory Commission, which, given what we know, carries a particular irony. He was accepted to the University of Utah School of Law. He was also, according to later assessments and the testimony of those who encountered him, a deeply skilled manipulator. Not in an obviously sinister way. That is the point. He presented warmth, competence, and charisma so convincingly that the people closest to him genuinely could not reconcile him with the crimes. Ann Rule, who worked alongside Bundy at a Seattle suicide prevention hotline, and later wrote what remains one of the definitive accounts of the case, said that knowing what she eventually learned was one of the most profoundly disorienting experiences of her life. She liked him. She had trusted him. He had walked her to her car. The crimes, we are going to do a documented chronology. The shadow years of 1969 and 1973. Researchers and investigators who spent decades on the Bundy case are almost unanimous in believing that his violence began earlier than the official record reflects. The confirmed murders began in 1974, but the pattern of behavior documented in his later crimes, the confidence, the methodology, the lack of hesitation, suggests someone who had practiced. Some investigators have tentatively linked him to crimes as early as 1969. Nothing has been conclusively proven, and I will not speculate beyond what the evidence supports. What we know about the shadow years is this. Bundy was working, studying, making political connections, and presenting to the world the image of a promising young man. Whatever was developing internally during these years, he kept it hidden with extraordinary efficiency. So 1974 is the year the pattern emerges. January 4th, 1974, Bundy breaks into a basement bedroom at a rooming house near the University of Washington campus in Seattle. His victim is 18-year-old Joni Lenz. He bludgeons her with a metal rod from her own bed frame. He sexually assaults her with a speculum taken from her roommate's medical bag. He leaves her alive, but barely. She survives with permanent brain damage and has never fully recovered. The attack is investigated as an isolated incident. January 31st, 1974. Linda Ann Healy is 21 years old. She is a psychology student at the University of Washington. She has a side job as a radio announcer on a local station. She disappears from her basement bedroom. Her roommates initially assume she has left early in the morning. When they look more carefully, they find her nightgown neatly laid on her bed, stained with blood. That's according to Pat Murphy, a lieutenant with the Seattle Police Department. Her skull is found 14 months later. March 12, 1974. Donna Gail Manson, 19, a student at Evergreen State College in Olympia, leaves her dormitory to walk to a campus concert. She's never seen again. No remains are ever definitively identified. April 17, 1974, Susan Elaine Rancourt, 18, a freshman at Central Washington State University in Ellensburg. She too disappears while walking between campus buildings at night. Her skull is later found alongside Healy's and others at a location called Taylor Mountain. May 6, 1974. Roberta Kathleen Parks, 20, a student at Oregon State University in Corvallis. She disappears while walking to meet friends at a dormitory. Parks is the first victim from outside of Washington State. It is a detail that would have significant implications for the investigation, because it meant her disappearance was handled by different law enforcement agencies, with no reason yet to connect it to the others. June 1st, 1974, Brenda Carroll Ball, a 22, last seen at the Flame Tavern in Burien, Washington. She disappears without a trace. Her skull is found at Taylor Mountain. June 11th, 1974, Georgianne Hawkins, 18, is a University of Washington student who disappears from a well-lit alley behind a sorority row, a very busy area with people nearby. Witnesses later report seeing a man on crutches struggling to carry a briefcase. Bundy later confessed to this murder. He described using a ruse involving physical helplessness to get victims to lower their guard. July 14th, 1974. This is the day the case breaks into the public consciousness, and the day that most clearly illustrates the particular audacity, or perhaps the sociopathic absence of risk assessment that define Bundy's crimes. At Lake Sammamish State Park, east of Seattle, in bright daylight, with thousands of people present, a man approaches multiple women. He is wearing his arm in a sling. He introduces himself to all of them as Ted. He asks for help loading a sailboat onto his car. 2 women who are approached decline. 2 did not. Janice Ann Ott, 23, is a probation case worker. She is seen walking toward the parking lot with the man who called himself Ted. Denise Marie Naslin, 19, disappears later the same afternoon from the same beach. Witnesses provide descriptions. Several mention the name Ted. Some describe a beige or tan Volkswagen Beetle. It is at this point that investigators in King County begin to understand that they are dealing with something they have not encountered before. 2 women taken from a crowded public space in a single afternoon. No screams. No physical struggle visible to bystanders. An approach so practiced that it would succeed in broad daylight, in a crowd. The remains of both women, along with those of Healy, Rancourt, Ball, Hawkins, are found at 2 locations on Taylor Mountain and near Issaquah in September 1974. In September of 1974, Bundy enrolls at the University of Utah College of Law in Salt Lake City. The murders in the Seattle area stop, but the murders in Utah begin. This happens after Bundy moves to Utah, as I said, in 1974. October 2nd, 1974, Nancy Wilcox, 16, disappears from Holiday, Utah. She is linked to Bundy through his later confessions, though her remains are never definitively located. October 18, 1974, Melissa Ann Smith, 17, the daughter of the Midvale police chief, disappears. Her body is found 9 days later in the mountains east of Salt Lake City. She has been raped and strangled. October 31st, 1974, Laura Ann Amy, 17, disappears on Halloween night after leaving a party in Lehi, Utah. Her body is found on Thanksgiving Day in American Fork Canyon. She has been beaten, raped, and also strangled. November 8, 1974, Carol Durant, the woman I told you about at the beginning. She survives. She is the only victim to encounter Bundy, escape, and later identify him. November 8, 1974, the same evening, Deborah Jean Kent, 17, attends a school play at Viewmont High School in Bountiful, Utah. She steps outside briefly and disappears. A key found in the parking lot later matches the handcuffs used on Carol Durant. Colorado, 1975. On January 12, 1975, Karen Eileen Campbell, 23, is on a ski vacation in Snowmass Village, Colorado. She steps away from her fiancé and his children in a hotel hallway to retrieve a magazine from their room. She is never seen alive again. Her body is found a month later in a snowbank near the road. March 15, 1975, Julie Cunningham, 26, a ski instructor in Vail, Colorado, disappears while walking to a friend's apartment. Bundy later confesses and describes using crutches and asking her to help carry ski boots. April 6, 1975, Denise Lynn Oliverson, 25, disappears while riding her bicycle to her parents' home in Grand Junction, Colorado. Her bicycle and sandals are found near an underpass, but her remains are never recovered. May 6, 1975, Lynette Dawn Culver, 12 years old, disappears from a school in Pocatello, Idaho. Bundy confesses to this murder in 1989, shortly before his execution. Then on June 28, 1975, Susan Curtis, 15, disappears from the Brigham Young University campus during a youth conference. Bundy confesses to this murder in his final days. The first arrest, August 1975. In the early years of August 16, 1975, a Utah Highway Patrol officer named Bob Hayward notices a Volkswagen Beetle driving without headlights in a residential neighborhood in Granger, Utah. The car speeds up when the officer turns on his lights. Eventually, it pulls over. The driver is polite, seemingly calm. He says he was coming from seeing a movie. The officer, suspicious, looks inside the car and finds a crowbar, an ice pick, torn strips of sheet, a ski mask, rope, handcuffs, wire, and a stocking mask with eye holes cut out. The driver's name is Ted Bundy. He is not arrested that night for murder. He is not arrested for the burglary tools initially. He is let go. But the officer files a report, and investigators in Salt Lake City who have been working the missing women cases for the better part of a year begin to look very carefully at the name Ted Bundy. Carol Durant picks him out of a lineup in October 1975. He is charged with kidnapping and aggravated assault. He is convicted in March 1976 and then sentenced to 1 to 15 years. In October 1976, he is charged with the murder of Karen Campbell in Colorado. He is then transferred to Aspen for trial. What happens next is one of the most consequential and, in retrospect, preventable sequences in the history of American criminal justice. In June 7, 1977, during a recess in a court hearing in Aspen, Colorado, Ted Bundy is allowed to visit the courthouse law library without handcuffs, under minimal supervision. He leaps from a second-floor window. He is free for 8 days, surviving in the mountains above Aspen before being recaptured. He was cold and disoriented near a roadblock. He is returned to the Garfield County Jail in Glenwood Springs. 6 months later, on December the 30th, 1977, guards notice during a routine check that Bundy is not in his cell. He has been losing weight deliberately for months. He has acquired a hacksaw blade and cut a small hole in the ceiling of his cell. He has crawled through, moving through the building, and walked out the front door. He is not discovered missing for about 15 hours. By the time the alarm goes out, Ted Bundy is already traveling east. He makes his way to Chicago, then to Atlanta, then to Tallahassee, Florida. He rents a room under a false name near the Florida State University campus. He has a total of 46 days of freedom. He uses them. Florida, from January to February of 1978. The early hours of January 15, 1978, the Chi Omega sorority house at Florida State University in Tallahassee. Bundy enters through a back door. In less than an hour, he attacks 4 women. He beats them with the length of oak log. He bites one of them, a key detail that will later become critical evidence at the trial. Margaret Bauman, 21, and Lisa Levy, 20, are killed. Kathy Kleiner and Karen Chandler survive, but with severe injuries. Within the same hour, less than half a mile away, he enters the apartment of Cheryl Thomas, a 21-year-old dance student. He attacks her. She survives with permanent hearing loss and damage to the vestibular system that ends her dance career forever. 4 victims in a single hour, 2 dead. The city of Tallahassee is in a state of shock. Bundy leaves. 3 weeks pass. February 9th, 1978. Lake City, Utah, Florida. Kimberly Diane Leach is 12 years old. She is in the 8th grade at Lake City Junior High. She steps back into the building from the playground briefly for some ordinary reason, to retrieve something, to take a message. She never returns to class. A van leaves the school parking lot. A witness sees a man walking with a young girl who does not appear entirely willing. Her remains are found 2 months early in a pig shed in Suwannee County. She is the youngest of Bundy's confirmed victims. She is 12 years old. On February the 15th, 1978, 6 days after Kimberly Leach's abduction, a Pensacola police officer runs the plate on a Volkswagen Beetle driving slowly through a residential neighborhood at 2 in the morning. The driver initially flees on foot. He is subdued and handcuffed. He gives a false name. Fingerprints identify him. Ted Bundy is in custody for the last time. The trials and execution. Bundy was never, take two. Bundy was tried twice in Florida, once for the Chi Omega murders and once for the murder of Kimberly Leach. Both trials were remarkable for reasons that deserve extended examination. He chose to act as his own counsel, a decision that most legal analysts have characterized as narcissistic delusion rather than tactical calculation. He was not as brilliant a legal mind as he believed himself to be, and the prosecution's case against him was overwhelming. In the Chi Omega trial, the bite mark evidence, a forensic odontologist compared the bite marks on Lisa Levy's body to a dental mole of Bundy's teeth and was presented to the jury. It was, at the time, some of the most significant forensic dental evidence in American criminal history. Judge Edward Coward, in a moment that has been quoted and analyzed endlessly, sentenced Bundy to death and then told him, from the bench, that he was a bright young man, that he would have made a good lawyer, and that it was a tragedy. Coward was not unique in this reaction. The dissonance between what Bundy appeared to be and what he was runs like a thread through every stage of this case. He was sentenced to death 3 times. He appealed for 11 years. During those years on death row, he gave various interviews, corresponded with researchers, and strategically offered to help locate the remains of victims he had not yet confessed to in exchange for delays in execution. Some of those offers led to the recovery of remains that brought closure to families who had been waiting for a decade or more. The calculation was entirely his own. In his final days, he confessed to 30 murders across 7 states. Most people who have studied the case believe the actual number is higher. Some estimates suggest it may be significantly so. He never gave a complete accounting. He took some of what he knew with him. And I quote him, "I'm as cold a motherfucker as you'd ever put your fucking eyes on. I don't give a shit about these people." That's what Ted Bundy told to investigator Bill Hagmaier in private, days before his execution. This was in contrast to the remorse he displayed in public interviews. Theodore Robert Bundy was executed in Florida's electric chair at 7:06 in the morning on January 24, 1989. Bundy was 42 years old. Crowds had gathered outside the prison the night before. People cheered when the lights dimmed. Some held signs. Vendors sold t-shirts. The morning papers ran his face on the front page again. And we can look at this through a sociological lens. I'm what I call the architecture of trust. I want to spend some time on a question that I think gets answered too quickly in most coverage of this case. How did he do it? Not in the operational sense. The ruses, the handcuffs, the car, but in the deeper sense. How did a man kill at least 30 women and girls over a period of years in multiple states, often in or near populated areas, without being caught earlier? How did so many people see him, interact with him, and remember him warmly? The answer if we're being rigorous about it, is that the conditions that allowed Ted Bundy to operate were not accidental. They were the product of specific, identifiable cultural and institutional structures. He didn't create those conditions. He exploited them. The first condition was appearance. Ted Bundy was white, conventionally attractive by the standards of his era. He was articulate, and he was well-dressed. He looked like the kind of man that 1970s American culture broadly, explicitly, and largely unconsciously taught people to trust. He looked like a professional. He looked like a colleague. He looked like someone else's son-in-law. Research in what psychologists call the halo effect, the tendency to attribute positive qualities to physically attractive people, is extensive and consistent. Attractive people are judged as being more competent, more honest, more morally sound. This is not a conscious choice by the people making these judgments. It is a deeply embedded cognitive bias. And in Bundy's case, it functioned as a kind of camouflage. The second condition was class. Bundy was a law student. He worked in Republican politics. He had the vocabulary and the social confidence of educated professional spaces. He knew how to move through institutions, how to present credentials, how to adopt authority, how to use the language and posture of legitimacy. When he told Carol Durant she was a police officer, she had no particular reason to doubt it. He sounded like a police officer. He held himself like a police officer. He had something that looked like a badge. The third condition is more uncomfortable to articulate, but it needs to be said plainly. There was a systematic cultural tendency to disbelieve the seriousness of what was happening to women. When young women began disappearing from Seattle campuses and parks in 1974, the initial response from many quarters, including some law enforcement and much of the press, was characterized by a subtle but real undercurrent of victim-attributed risk. Had they been hitchhiking? Had they been somewhere they shouldn't have been? Had they made choices that put themselves in danger? This framing was not only factually wrong. Bundy's victims were taken from campuses, from shopping malls, from crowded beaches, from their own dormitory bedrooms. They were not careless. They were targeted. But it was also deeply dangerous because it directed investigative and public attention towards the behavior of victims rather than toward the identification of a perpetrator. The women's movement and the politics of danger. The peak of Bundy's killing years, 1974 to 1978, is not an arbitrary time frame. It coincides almost exactly with the most intense period of the women's liberation movement in America, and with the cultural backlash against it. The Equal Rights Amendment had just passed Congress in 1972, and it was moving through state ratification. Women were entering law schools, medical schools, and professional programs in numbers that were genuinely unprecedented at the time. They were living independently in ways that the previous generation largely had not. In university dormitories, in apartments, and cities, all on their own terms. There was a powerful, vocal, and often explicitly misogynist response to these changes. Phyllis Schlafly's Stop Era campaign, which was launched in 1972, mobilized a national movement around the argument that women's liberation was not liberation at all, but a threat to the natural order. The rhetoric of this period frequently positioned independent women as having abandoned the protections that came with traditional femininity. Feminist scholars were analyzing this dynamic in real time. Susan Brown Miller's landmark 1975 book, titled Against Our Will, argued that sexual violence is not a deviation from social norms, but a mechanism for enforcing them, that rape and the threat of rape function to restrict women's movement, to make them dependent on men for protection, to punish independence. Her analysis was controversial when it was published. It has since been validated by decades of subsequent research. In this context, the response to Bundy's crimes from many official quarters is illuminating. The primary advice issued to women in King County after the Lake Sammamish disappearances was, restrict your movement. Don't go out alone. Don't be in public parks. Ask a man to accompany you. The advice was given in good faith from concern, but its structural effect was to place a burden of safety on the potential victims rather than on identifying and stopping the perpetrator. And it communicated, however unintentionally, that women's independence itself was the risk factor. The media, the celebrity, and the mythology. I need to talk about the media coverage of this case, including the coverage of the trials in 1979 and 1980, because it established patterns that have shaped true crime media ever since, and that I think we haven't fully reckoned with. The Florida trials were treated as a spectacle in ways that are, in retrospect, quite extraordinary. Bundy was the first criminal trial to be fully televised, and the camera coverage revealed something about how the culture processed this case that is both fascinating and quite disturbing. Bundy performed for the cameras. He argued with attorneys, cross-examined witnesses, and presented himself as a man unjustly accused, or at a minimum, as a man who was compelling to watch. And people watched. The courtrooms were packed. Female spectators attended day after day. Fan mail arrived at the jail by the bag. Women sent photographs. Some sent explicit letters. A woman named Carol Ann Boone, who had known Bundy during his time in the Washington state criminal justice system, attended the trial and ultimately declared herself married to him during testimony, exploiting a Florida legal provision, and later had his child. This is often recounted as a curiosity, a footnote about extreme behavior at the margins. I think that framing lets us off the hook too easily. The women who corresponded with Bundy were not representative of most people, but the cultural appetite that their behavior represented, the desire to center his perspective, to engage with his intelligence and charm, to be interested primarily in him rather than in his victims, was representative of something much broader. The way Ted Bundy was covered then and since is a case study in what happens when we prioritize the legibility of a perpetrator over the humanity of the people he destroyed. His victims are known, when they are known at all, as a category, Bundy's victims. They appear in lists, they are evidence, they are numbers. On this podcast and on virtually every other platform where his story has been told. I am aware of the irony. I am not sure there is a way around it, given what we are trying to do, but I want to name it explicitly. The structure of the story, as it is typically told, centers a perpetrator and asks the audience to be fascinated by him. That is a choice, and it has its costs. Missing white women syndrome and the hierarchy of victims. There is a term coined by journalist and broadcast pioneer Gwen Ifill and later formalized in academic literature called missing white women syndrome. It describes a documented and well-studied phenomenon in American media: the vastly disproportionate coverage given to missing and murdered white women and girls relative to missing and murdered women of color. This is not a matter of opinion. It is measurable. Studies of media coverage going back decades consistently find that the disappearance of a white woman, particularly a young, conventionally attractive white woman, receives orders of magnitude more attention than the disappearance of a Black, Indigenous, or Latino woman in otherwise similar circumstances. Bundy's victims were almost all white. They received enormous coverage. Their disappearances generated task forces, numerous press conferences, composite sketches, and a sustained public attention. That attention was appropriate. These were murders that deserve investigative resources and public urgency. But in the same years and in the years since, Indigenous women in the United States were disappearing at rates far exceeding their share of the population. With a fraction of the investigative resources and essentially no sustained media attention. The FBI's own data consistently shows that missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls are dramatically underrepresented in federal databases and dramatically underserved by both law enforcement and the media. This is not a separate issue from the Bundy case. It is the same issue, but seen from a different angle. The question of whose disappearance is treated as a crisis and whose is treated as a statistic is the same question that determined how quickly Bundy's crimes were recognized and how urgently they were investigated. In both cases, the answer tracks very closely to race and class, the structural conditions that created the Bundy case's particular contours, the patterns of attention and inattention, belief and disbelief, urgency and neglect, did not end with his execution. They are still operating. The political and legal aftermath, what failure produced, the reform of American law enforcement. If the Bundy case was a catastrophic failure of detection and prevention, and it was eventually a catalyst. The specific gaps that allowed Bundy to operate for years across multiple states produce a sustained reckoning in American law enforcement and policy that reshape how the country investigates, tracks, and responds to violent crime. This is one of the most direct and measurable policy legacies of any criminal case in American history. And I think it deserves a serious examination rather than a passing mention. The FBI's Behavioral Science Unit was founded in 1972, but its most significant work came in the years following the Bundy case. Agents Robert Ressler and John Douglas conducted extensive interviews with incarcerated serial killers throughout the late 1970s and the 1980s. Bundy among them. and interviews conducted by Douglas in the months before Bundy's execution. The goal was to develop a systematic body of knowledge about the psychology, behavior patterns, and typologies of repeat violent offenders. Before this work, investigators approached each case largely in isolation. After it, law enforcement had a framework for recognizing patterns, for generating psychological profiles of unknown suspects, and for distinguishing between different categories of violent offenders in ways that could direct investigative resources more efficiently. This is not without controversy. Criminal profiling has been criticized, sometimes correctly, for being more art than science, for encoding racial biases into its typologies, and for being presented to juries and public as more determinative than the evidence supports. These are legitimate criticisms, but the underlying impulse, the recognition that violent repeat offenders have patterns of behavior that can be analyzed, that investigation needs to be psychological as well as forensic, was a genuine advance. And it came directly from the failures that cases like Bundy's exposed. Perhaps the single most direct institutional response to the Bundy case and to a cluster of similar cases in the same period was the creation of the Violent Criminal Apprehension Program, known as VICAP, in 1985. The problem that VICAP was designed to solve was a problem that Bundy had exploited so effectively: the complete absence of any mechanism for connecting violent crimes across different jurisdictions. A murder in King County, Washington was investigated by King County detectives. A murder in Summit County, Utah was investigated by Summit County detectives. There was no centralized system, no shared database, no regular communication between agencies that might have allowed the pattern to emerge earlier. Bundy crossed state lines deliberately and with full awareness of what this meant for detection. He varied his methods enough to complicate recognition within individual jurisdictions. He moved geographically whenever scrutiny in a particular area began to intensify. VICAP created a national database of violent crimes, murders, attempted murders, missing persons suspected to be victims of homicide, and unidentified remains. Law enforcement agencies can enter case data and search for similarities across a database. It is not a perfect system. Participation by local agencies has historically been inconsistent, and the database has been repeatedly criticized for having significant gaps. But it represents a fundamental change in the architecture of violent crime investigation in the United States. Before Bundy, such a system did not exist. After him, its necessity was inarguable. Bundy's final confirmed murder of Kimberly Leach, 12 years old, taken from her school grounds in broad daylight, had political consequences that extended well beyond serial crime investigation. What we're talking about is the Missing Children Act of 1982 and the NCMEC. In 1981, in an unrelated but politically proximate case, 6-year-old Adam Walsh was abducted from a Florida shopping mall and murdered. His father, John Walsh, became one of the most prominent and effective child safety advocates in American history. The combination of the Walsh case and the broader awareness of child abduction that cases like Leach's had generated created significant political pressure for federal action. In 1982, Congress passed the Missing Children Act, which, for the first time, required the FBI to maintain records of missing children and created a federal framework for responding to child abductions that had been previously treated as exclusively local matters. In 1984, the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children was established with a mandate to maintain a clearinghouse of information on missing children, to provide technical assistance to law enforcement, and to serve as a resource for families. The NCMEC has been involved in over 370,000 cases since its founding. It did not emerge from nowhere. It was a product of sustained political pressure from advocates and families who had watched the system fail their children. Of all the political legacies of the Bundy case, another broader wave of serial crime cases in the 70s and the 1980s, the most lasting and constructive is probably the transformation of how crime victims are treated within the criminal justice system. And what we're going to talk about is the victims' rights movement and its legislative legacy. Before the 1970s, victims had almost no formal standing in their own cases. They were witnesses. Their testimony was just evidence. Their families were just spectators. There was no formal right to be notified of hearings and proceedings, no right to speak at sentencing, no formal protections for privacy or recovery, no systematic provision of information about where the case stood and what was being done. The advocacy work that emerged from the Bundy era and from related cases, led largely by survivors, by the families of victims, and by women's organizations, was patient, sustained, and ultimately transformative. The National Organization for Victim Assistance, founded in 1975, helped coordinate this advocacy nationally. Individual states began passing notification laws through the late 1970s and 1980s. At the federal level, the Victims of Crime Act of 1984 established a Crime Victims Fund, providing federal money for victim compensation and assistance programs. The Victims' Right and Restitution of 1990 codified a set of basic rights for federal crime victims, including the right to notification, the right to attend proceedings, and the right to make a statement at the sentencing. The Criminal Victims' Rights Act of 2004 significantly expanded these protections and provided enforcement mechanisms. Today, 33 states have passed constitutional amendments protecting victims' rights. The transformation from victim as witness to victim as participant with legal standing is one of the most significant changes in American criminal procedure over the past 50 years. It did not happen because legislatures spontaneously decided to prioritize victims. It happened because advocates, many of them connected to cases like Bundy's, demanded it and did not stop demanding it. The Bundy case has become a touchstone in American debate about capital punishment. And I want to engage with this honestly because it is a genuinely complicated subject and I don't think serves anyone to flatten it. So we are going to talk about the death penalty and the politics of punishment. When Bundy was executed on January 24, 1989, American public support for the death penalty was at or near its historical peak. Gallup polling from 1988 placed support at approximately 79%. That's nearly 4 in 5 Americans. Bundy's execution was treated in many quarters as a straightforward case. Perhaps the straightforward case. A man whose guilt was beyond doubt, whose crimes were beyond horror, whose execution was therefore beyond debate. Outside the Florida State Prison that morning, hundreds of people gathered to celebrate. Radio stations played "Burn, Bundy, Burn." The governor of Florida's office received calls from around the country, most of them expressing satisfaction. The message in the popular response was clear. Justice finally had been done. Death penalty opponents did not argue in any significant number that Bundy should live. The argument they made was different. It is worth engaging with seriously. They argued that Bundy's case was being used to justify a system that in practice operates very differently from how it operated in this case. They pointed to data showing then and now that the probability of receiving a death sentence in the United States is determined less by the severity of the crime than by the race of the defendant, the race of the victim, the quality of legal representation available to the defendant, and the geography of the jurisdiction where the crime occurred. Black defendants charged with the murder of white victims were convicted and sentenced to death at significantly higher rates than white defendants charged with equivalent crimes. Defendants who cannot afford competent legal representation are sentenced to death at higher rates than those who can. These are not opinions. These are findings from decades of empirical research, including a landmark study called the Balda Study, submitted to the Supreme Court in McCleskey v. Camp in 1987, 2 years before Bundy's execution. The court acknowledged the data and ruled that statistical evidence of racial disparity was insufficient to overturn an individual death sentence. The death penalty abolitionist argument about Bundy was essentially this. His case is the exception. Clear guilt, extensive documentation, overwhelming evidence, white defendant, white victims, a maximum resources devoted to prosecution and investigation. The case that is used to justify capital punishment is not the case that capital punishment is typically applied to. And in a system where the ultimate sanction is irreversible, the exception cannot be allowed to obscure the rule. I am not telling you what to think about capital punishment. It is a genuinely contested moral and political question. And it would be dishonest of me to pretend it isn't. What I am saying is that the Bundy execution, treated by many as a moment of obvious, unambiguous justice, was also a moment that required more examination than it typically received. And here's a lasting question. What changed and what did not? VICAP changed. Criminal profiling changed. Missing children policy changed. Victims' rights legislation changed. The forensic sciences that would eventually allow investigators to close cold cases with DNA evidence were in their earliest stages in 1989 and have since transformed the field. What did not change, or did not change nearly enough? The crisis of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls has never received the same investigative resources or the same legislative attention that it demands. The MMIWG crisis, as it is now known, missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, remains one of the most severe and systematically under-addressed human rights failures in American and Canadian history. Federal action has been halting and inadequate. Media attention has been sporadic at best. The racial disparities in who receives the death penalty have not been resolved. They have been documented more thoroughly, litigated more extensively, and in some states addressed more directly through moratoriums and abolition. But the disparity itself persists in the states that continue to apply the sentence. The cultural tendency to center perpetrators and marginalize victims in media coverage of violent crime is, if anything, more pronounced than it was in 1979. The true crime genre, which includes this podcast, has exploded in the past decade. Much of it is excellent journalism and necessary public education. Some of it is exploitive entertainment that packages human suffering as a subscription product. The line between those things is not always clear, and every person working in this space, including me, has an obligation to think seriously about which side of it they are on. Let's look at what the research actually says about the psychology of predation. I want to spend some time on the psychology because I think it has been simultaneously overexplained and at the same time under-examined in most popular coverage. Overexplained in a sense that every documentary and book has offered some narrative of childhood trauma or developmental pathology that purports to explain Bundy's violence. Under-examined in the sense that the popular explanations often obscure more than they illuminate. Let me start with what we can say with reasonable confidence. Ted Bundy meets the clinical criteria for what the DSM-5 now categorizes as antisocial personality disorder. And most clinical assessments have also described features consistent with narcissistic personality disorder and psychopathy as measured by instruments like the Hare Psychopathy Checklist. He displayed consistently and across multiple contexts a profound absence of empathy, a calculating use of other people as instruments for his own purposes, a facility for deception that extended to his closest relationships, and what appeared to be a complete absence of genuine remorse. His public expressions of remorse in his final days, including a widely viewed interview with James Dobson, a Christian conservative activist, in which Bundy attributed his crimes to pornography, were assessed by virtually every investigator and clinician who knew him as performance rather than genuine feeling. His private statements to investigators told a very different story. He was, until the end, more interested in managing his image and delaying his execution than in accountability. The pornography claim deserves specific address because it was amplified extensively and has had lasting influence. In the interview conducted the day before his execution, Bundy told Dobson that his descent began with exposure to pornography and escalated from there to violent pornography and ultimately to violence itself. Anti-pornography advocates and conservative religious organizations cited this interview extensively in the years following his execution. The research does not support the causal chain Bundy described. The empirical literature on pornography and violence is very complex and contested, but there is no robust evidence that pornography exposure causes sexual violence. Most people who view pornography do not commit sexual violence. Most sexual violence is committed by people whose pathology preceded and is not explained by their media consumption. Investigators who knew Bundy understood his interview as a final manipulation. He knew what Dobson wanted to hear. He knew the claim would generate attention, and he knew it provided a narrative that externalized responsibility for what he had done. So then, what explains Bundy's behavior? This is a question that serious researchers approached with considerable humility, because the honest answer is that we do not have a complete explanation. We can identify risk factors, developmental patterns, and neurological correlates associated with psychopathy. We cannot, however, reliably predict at the individual level who will act on violent impulses and who will not. We cannot identify with certainty what combination of biology, development, circumstance, and choice produces someone like Ted Bundy. What we can say is that the search for a single clean explanation is probably itself a mistake. It reflects a desire for a story in which violence is produced by something identifiable and therefore potentially preventable at the individual level. The more uncomfortable truth may be that the conditions that enabled Bundy, the institutional gaps, the cultural biases, the patterns of disbelief, are at least as relevant to preventing further violence as any understanding of his individual psychology. So this brings up the question of early warning signs. One of the most debated aspects of the Bundy case is whether there were recognizable warning signs earlier in his life that were missed or completely ignored. This question matters for prevention, but it also has to be approached carefully because retrospective identification of risk factors is a notoriously unreliable process. There are documented incidents from Bundy's adolescence that have been cited in various accounts. Reported incidents of voyeurism, undescribed interest in violent crime and detective magazines, a neighbor who later recalled finding him in her bedroom as a child. These accounts vary in their sourcing and credibility, and some have been amplified beyond what the evidence supports. What is documented more firmly is a pattern of behavior in his adult relationships that, in retrospect, his partners describing as controlling, deceptive, and at times frightening. Elizabeth Kendall, who was in a relationship with Bundy for several years during his period of most intense criminal activity, wrote about this in her memoir. She describes incidents she had explained to herself at the time, but that later understood very differently. She was not naive or foolish. She was in a relationship with someone who was presenting an entirely false version of himself with extraordinary skill in a cultural context that had taught her to trust the presentation. So the warning signs question is valuable for what it reveals about the limits of individual detection and the necessity of systemic response. We cannot reliably identify future violent offenders from personality assessments or behavioral observations in adolescence. What we can do is build systems that make it harder for violence to continue undetected, that make it easier for victims and potential victims to be believed, and that distribute investigative resources based on risk rather than on the demographic characteristics of victims. All of this brings us to their names. I want to say their names, not as a ritual, not as a performance of solemnity, but because the structure of the story, the structure of virtually every story told about this case, has a tendency to make them abstract, to make them evidence, to make them a list that explains why his name is famous. They were people. They had families who are still alive. They had plans and preferences and friends in ordinary days, They were ended by one man's violence and a society's inadequate response to it. I want to tell you something about each of them beyond their name and their age, to the extent the record allows. Joni Lenz, she was 18 years old, a University of Washington student. She survived the attack on January 4th, 1974, but she sustained permanent brain damage. She has lived with the consequences of that night for more than 50 years. Linda Ann Healy, she was 21, a psychology student who supplemented her income by doing early morning radio work for a local station. Her friends remembered her as a warm and funny person. Her family waited for answers for over a year before her remains were found. Donna Gail Manson, 19 years old, a student at Evergreen State College in Olympia. She was drawn to art and to music. She left for a campus jazz concert and never came home. Her remains were never definitively identified. Susan Elaine Rancourt, 18 years old, a freshman at Central Washington State University. She was known for her love of animals. She had been walking between buildings on campus at night. Her skull was found 14 months after her disappearance. Roberta Kathleen Parks, 20 years old, a student at Oregon State University in Corvallis. She was on her way to meet friends at a dormitory when she was taken. Her family in New Jersey waited years for answers. Brenda Carol Ball, 22 years old. She was last seen at a tavern in Burien, Washington. She enjoyed music and had a wide circle of friends. Her skull was found at Taylor Mountain. Georgine Hawkins, 18 years old, a member of a University of Washington sorority, taken from a well-lit alley that should have been safe. She had been on the phone with her boyfriend minutes before she disappeared. Janice Ann Ott, 23 years old, a probation case worker who spent her professional life helping people navigate the justice system. She was sunbathing at Lake Sammamish on a summer Sunday when a man in a sling asked for her help. She was kind enough to say yes. Denise Marie Naslin, 19 years old, also at Lake Sammamish that same Sunday. She had a boyfriend. She was studying computer science. She was killed the same day as Janice Ott. Carol Valenzuela, 20 years old, from Vancouver, Washington. She was missing for months before her remains were found near Olympia. Her death was not connected to Bundy until years later. Nancy Wilcox, 16 years old, from Holiday, Utah. Bundy confessed to her murder in his final days. Her remains have never been definitively found. Melissa Ann Smith, 17 years old, the daughter of the Midvale police chief. The cruelty of that detail has never been lost on the investigators who worked her case. Laura Ann Ames, 17 years old. She was taken on Halloween night in Lehi, Utah, found on Thanksgiving Day in a canyon east of the city. Deborah Jean Kent, 17 years old, taken from the parking lot of her high school during a school play. The key found her car matched the handcuffs used on Carol Durance the same evening. Karen Eileen Campbell, 23 years old, a nurse from Michigan on a ski vacation in Colorado with her fiancé and his children. She walked down a hotel hallway to get a magazine and never came back. Julie Cunningham, 26 years old, a ski instructor in Vail, Colorado. She was athletic and independent and had built a life she loved in the mountains. She was on her way to a friend's apartment. Denise Lynn Oliverson, 25 years old, from Grand Junction, Colorado, riding her bicycle to her parents' house on a spring afternoon. Her bicycle was found. She was not. Lynette Dawn Culver, 12 years old, from Pocatello, Idaho. Bundy confessed to her murder from death row 11 years after her death. Just 12 years old. Susan Curtis. She was 15 years old, attending a youth conference at Brigham Young University in Provo, Utah. Bundy confessed to her murder in the days before his execution. Lisa Levy, 20 years old, a Florida State University student, killed in her bedroom in the Chi Omega sorority house in the early hours of January the 15th, 1978. Margaret Bauman, 21 years old, also killed in the Chi Omega house at night. She was a student from Lake Forest, Illinois. She had just finished her junior year. Kimberly Diane Leach, 12 years old. She was in the 8th grade. She was taken from her school grounds on a February morning in Lake City, Florida. She is the youngest of his confirmed victims, and for many investigators and advocates, her name is the one they find hardest to say. Carol Durange, Kathy Kleiner, Karen Chandler, and Cheryl Thomas survived. They carried what happened to them into the rest of their lives. Survival is not a clean ending. I've been sitting with this case for months in the way you have to when you intend to talk about it seriously. And what I keep returning to is not Ted Bundy. What I keep returning to are the gaps. The gaps in the systems that allowed him to move across state lines without triggering recognition. The gaps in the culture that made his charm and his appearance more credible than the testimony of the women who reported him. The gaps in the media coverage that placed his intelligence and his good looks in the headline and buried his victims in the final paragraph. Some of those gaps have been closed. VICAP exists. The National Center for Missing and Exploited Children exists. The Crime Victims' Rights Acts exist. Forensic DNA and analysis has transformed what cold case investigators can do. These are all real achievements, built by real people who looked at the failures this case exposed and refused to accept them. But some of the gaps are still there. The crisis of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls is not a historical footnote. It is happening right now, this year, with insufficient resources and insufficient attention. The racial disparities in who is believed, who is searched for, who is found, and who is mourned publicly. These are not remnants of the 1970s. They are operating right now. The true crime genre, which I am a part of, and which I take seriously as a genre, has a responsibility that I think we had not always discharged well. The responsibility to be clear about why we are telling these stories. The responsibility to center the humanity of victims rather than the mythology of perpetrators. The responsibility to ask structural questions rather than only psychological ones. The responsibility to put down the story when we have nothing more to add and to pick it back up when we do. This episode is my attempt to discharge some of that responsibility. I don't think it's complete. I don't think that any single episode could be. But I hope it has given you something to think about that extends beyond the man whose name is in the title. If you found this episode valuable, feel free to share it with someone you think needs to hear it. Not for the crime, for the history, for the structures, for the names. The show notes for this episode include links to the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, to the MMIWG resources and advocacy organizations, and to support services for survivors of sexual violence and families of missing persons. Please use them if they are useful to you. Next episode, we continue into the 1980s to a case that forced the country to confront serial violence as a systemic crisis rather than a series of isolated tragedies. I'll see you then. Take care of yourselves.